Last week we finished with the death of Solomon and his betrayal, and I wanted to talk just a brief moment about the nature of that betrayal. As I mentioned before, I'm greatly curious and puzzled by the church's minimizing or perhaps even ignoring the nature of his betrayal at the end of his life. It said the Lord became angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from, and incidentally that's Yahweh. Yahweh became angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from Yahweh, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice. And it goes on to say that, among other things, he initiated pagan worships and he followed Moloch, the detestable god of the Ammonites. I wanted to give you a suggestion of the severity of this betrayal by the nature of Moloch. Moloch was a pagan god that accepted child sacrifice, not children, babies. Baby sacrifice. He's been depicted in various writings, various historical writings, Herodotus and a few others that are writing much later, but apparently he was a big bronze god. Here's a picture of him as it's been interpreted. A big bronze god with his arms out extended, with some kind of a fire either between his hands or his belly, and the babies would be taken and rolled down their arms into the fire screaming. The children were picked at random. The mothers were given money, and they were supposed to stand there and smile proudly that their child had been selected to carry a message to Moloch, and if they screamed or cried or showed any emotion, the money was taken away from them. This is the God that Solomon was worshiping at the end of his life. It's not just a pagan god, it's the worst of the pagan gods. The pagan worship continued on into Carthage, which is they're the cultural and philosophical descendants of the Phoenicians. Phoenicians started to settle the Mediterranean in the 800s. They formed Carthage on North Africa, and they found shrines there with hundreds and hundreds of baby bodies, bones. And so this is Moloch, the detestable god of the Ammonites. So what Yahweh said to Solomon was, since you've not kept my covenant and my decrees, I'll tear the kingdom away from you and give it to one of your subordinates. And this is what he did. It was given to Jeroboam. Solomon reigned in Jerusalem for 40 years, and then he rested with his fathers. That means he died. And he was buried in the city of David, meaning Jerusalem, David his father. And I wanted to go into a little bit of the consequences of his betrayal. I wanted to do two things today. I want to talk about Solomon and his betrayal and the division of the kingdom to kind of bring things to a close. And then I want to show you the temple. The temple is the central feature, the central structure of the Jewish faith for 1,000 years. And it was Solomon that built it according to the plans that had been laid by David, so I thought we should talk about that just a little bit. When Solomon died, it says, Rehoboam, his son, succeeded him as king. The kingship was apparently hereditary in the sense that it was father and son, but you get the sense that when Rehoboam went north to address the assembly of the northern tribes, perhaps it wasn't obligatory that they accept him as king. Or at the very least, he'd gone north to introduce himself and discuss what he was going to do, and they rejected him anyway, a little bit like perhaps the Magna Carta and King John. The assembly of Israel, meaning the northern tribes, the 11 northern tribes, said to Rehoboam, your father put a heavy yoke on us, but now lighten the harsh labor and the heavy yoke, and we will serve you. That certainly carries with it the suggestion that they're saying, if you don't lighten the heavy yoke, we won't serve you, and that's exactly what happened. So Rehoboam went to his advisors. Who were these men? The elders were the ones who had advised Solomon. In other words, these are the fellows that had been imposing the heavy yoke, telling Solomon what to do and what not to do. And they even suggested, maybe you better lighten up on these folks. It's been pretty rough, the taxation, the forced labor, and so on. But then he went to his younger advisors, the young lions, his cousins, his brothers, his friends, all of the people that were going to form the new administration, and they didn't want to give up any power. So they said, you tell them that you're going to continue and that they'll have to accept it. So This is what Rehoboam said. My little finger is thicker than my father's waist. Now this is a curious thing to say, and it has been modified slightly. It's not my intent ever to be indelicate, but what this is biblical trash talk. And I wanted to let you know what exactly it does mean. It's been interpreted saying, you thought my father was tough and big. My little finger's bigger than his waist. You know, I'm bigger, stronger. It's going to be worse. But that's not what he's saying. The NIV has translated the Hebrew word as waist. The ESV does a little better job. It says, my little finger's thicker than my father's thighs. You can see where we're headed on this. The venerable old King James Version gets a lot closer to it. A literal interpretation is my father's loins. And loins is a euphemism for the male anatomy. So basically what he's saying is, you thought my father was tough. My little finger's bigger. Well, anyway, you get where I'm going on this. And so it's trash talk. And then he follows that with, my father made your yoke heavy. I will make it even heavier. My father scourged you with whips. I will scourge you with scorpions. Now, he's not talking about the arachnids. Scorpions aren't insects, incidentally. I majored in biology. They're arachnids, you know, these little creatures running around. He's not talking about that. He's talking about a special type of whip that was designed to increase the punishment. The Romans had something called a flagrum, which is sort of like it, and the British had their cat o' nine tails. You'd take the strips of leather and put little pieces of metal in it, or lead, or broken bone, sharp little pieces of bone, so that when you whipped and then pulled, the whip would dig into the skin and tear the skin. And this is what was done to scourge Jesus. He was scourged with that. He was terribly punished. So anyway, he's saying, yeah, my father whipped you, but if you get into problems with me, I'm going to use a scorpion. I'm not even going to go lightly with you. This is what he said. And then he gave them 3 days to make their decision, and then he came back with Adoniram, who was his foreman in charge of forced labor. In other words, this is the guy that really implemented all of the policies. And their answer was very clear. Rehoboam sent out Adoniram, who was in charge of forced labor, but they stoned him to death. And then they turned on Rehoboam, and we're told he just barely got away with his life. He jumped in his chariot and escaped to Jerusalem. So they rejected him at that point. Now, you need a leader. You have these northern tribes, you need a leader of some sort. And when the Israelites heard that Jeroboam had returned from Egypt, remember, Solomon tried to kill Jeroboam, and Jeroboam fled to Egypt until Solomon died. When Solomon died, word would have come down with trade caravans or whatever that the king in Israel is gone. Jeroboam came back, headed up to the northern tribes, and it said when they heard that Jeroboam had returned from Egypt, they made him king over all Israel. In other words, he was not of the royal line, he was not of the Davidic line. Only the tribe of Judah remained loyal to the house of David. So he got the southern tribe of Judah. The northern people called themselves Israel. And the southern kingdom, which was basically a very small territory that had Jerusalem and the temple, they called themselves Judah. So we have the divided kingdom of Israel and Judah now. Jeroboam worsened things. He thought to himself, if these people go up to offer sacrifices at the temple of Yahweh in Jerusalem, they will kill me and return to King Rehoboam. What that means is, at that time, the worship of Yahweh, the Israelite worship, involved going to the temple and making sacrifices in the temple, at least occasionally. They had Levite priests all over the region, but you were expected to go to Jerusalem, to the temple, because that's where God lived. The concept of an omnipresent God had not been decided at that point. They believed that God was down there in Jerusalem. And Jeroboam was thinking that when these people want to go worship, they're going to go to Jerusalem, and then they're going to decide they don't need me. We might as well go back to Rehoboam, and they will kill me and return to King Rehoboam. So he solved the problem this way. He invented his own pagan religion. He made 2 golden calves and said to the people, "It's too much for you to go up to Jerusalem. Here are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt." In other words, you don't have to go down there. We have gods here too. It's a pagan religion. He set up a temple in Bethel, Bet-El. Bethel is where Jacob was traveling north and had the dream of the angels climbing the ladder, Jacob's ladder. That was Bethel, Bet-El. And the other was in Dan at the northern end of the kingdom. And then to worsen things, it says he built shrines in high places, appointed priests from all sorts of people, even though they were not Levites. They were political cronies, non-Levites, non-priests. He instituted his own festival, offered sacrifices as a high priest, which he was not permitted to do. In other words, he invented a completely pagan religion. And this is what was referred to as the sin of Jeroboam, repeatedly through the Bible. All of the successor kings up there continued to use this particular form of worship to keep their people in line. I wanted to show you how that plays out. The yellow area there inside the black marker is basically the territory that was controlled by Solomon at the time of his death. There were various external kingdoms or small communities, Aram, the Ammonites, the Moabites, the Edomites, the Philistines, that were controlled, or at least under the hegemony of Solomon, and they were all ruled from Jerusalem. Rehoboam went north up to Shechem, which is the main city in the northern region at that particular time, and this is where all the elders came to discuss with him what they were going to do. They had their falling out, and the net result was dividing the kingdom pretty much along the border right north of Jerusalem. So the tribe of Judah is the area that you see in the blue there, and the tribe of Israel, or the kingdom of Israel, is the area to the north. Now, once they were divided, this tiny kingdom of Israel became 2 much smaller little kingdoms, and as a result, they were unable to maintain their hegemony, and they lost all their external holdings over the next generation or 2. So now you have a kingdom that was able to hold on for a while, but when they divided in half, they were so weakened that they couldn't stand up to the outside powers. Egypt was recovering, the Assyrians up north were recovering, and then to further worsen things, Jeroboam created a pagan temple with a golden calf at Bethel, right at the south end of their territory, and all the way up north at Dan. So anybody in his kingdom could go north or south and worship at a temple, worship a god. It doesn't matter whether it's the god, but at least you could go and go through the routine. So that's what that amounted to. And unfortunately, they were unable to withstand the outside influences. The sin of Jeroboam had weakened them so much, and they were being punished, that eventually the Assyrians, a couple of hundred years later, conquered everything on the coast. They attacked Jerusalem, but were unable to destroy Jerusalem. And so what happened is you have this tiny little kingdom of Judah, which is about the size of Sarasota County. They call it the Kingdom of Judah, but it's a tiny little territory with the city of Jerusalem. Assyrians everywhere else, and they paid tribute and were able to survive for a while. But there was really nothing there that made it worthwhile for the Assyrians to come back and try again. It was just a city. There was no value to the territory of Judah. It was just a little farm area, basically. 100 and some years later, the Babylonians, who were a city in the southern part of Assyria, fomented rebellion, took over Assyria, and as a result, the Babylonians end up controlling that whole area. And they came to Judah, and this was Nebuchadnezzar. He came and said, "I will leave you alone if you pay tribute and don't cause problems." Well, the sons and grandson of Josiah didn't do so. The Babylonians came back a second time and said, "We're not going to warn you again." And a third time in 586, they came back and they conquered the city of Jerusalem. They tore it down, and the survivors, anybody who had any skills, craftsmen, teachers, nobility, and so forth, were carried off into exile. And then we have them in exile for 50 years, and then the Persians came, and then Alexander came, and then the Romans came, and then Muhammad and the Muslims came, and then the Crusaders came, and then the Muslims again, and then the Ottoman Turks, and then in World War I, the Ottoman Turks lost everything, and the Western powers divided it all up and created the mess that we have in the Middle East now. So that was the long-term result of the sin of Jeroboam and the betrayal, the terrible betrayal of Solomon. Okay. Oh, I love the site of Dan. The very northern end. It's the one place in the Bible, it's the one place in the Holy Land where you can go to a spot that's mentioned in the Bible and see it as it looked at the time it was written. This site was never built over. This is the site of the temple that was created by Jeroboam at Dan. You can see the foundation there. The temple would have been some kind of a structure on that foundation, and the altar, the foundations of the altar are out there. Raises the hair on the back of your neck. I mean, just to stand in that place and to read the text and to see that that's where Jeroboam did his sin. We're going to talk now about the temple very quickly. I wanted to show you what it looks like. We are told that after David was settled in his palace, he said to Nathan the prophet, "Here I am living in a palace of cedar, while the ark of the covenant of the Lord is under a tent." You remember, he conquered the city of Jerusalem. The ark had been kept down at Kiryat Yearim on the hillside. They brought it up, and he had no place to put it, and he put it in a small tent, which is the way it had been kept since the time of the Exodus. It had been kept in a tent wherever it was kept. And what he wanted to do was build a temple. We don't have time to go into all the maneuvering that went on there, but basically it was informed to him by the various priests that David would not be building the temple, Solomon would build the temple. David bought the threshing floor of Araunah. I've shown you this before. You have the three valleys that surrounded the ancient city of Jerusalem, the Kidron, the Tyropoeon, and the Hinnom. And that structure that you see in the middle on that little spit of land is the ancient city of David, which is about 10 acres, a couple of thousand people maximum. The hill to the north is Mount Moriah, and that is where the threshing field of Araunah was located. So David went up and bought the threshing field, and on the threshing field, he created an altar. David said, "The house of the Lord God is to be here, and also the altar of burnt offering for Israel." So we now know where the temple's going to go eventually, and the Lord said, "Solomon is the one who will build a house for my name." David denied the right to build the temple, made all the preparations, and we're told exactly what he did here. It's fairly extensive. And he told Solomon, incidentally, before he died, "I've taken great pains to provide for the temple of the Lord, which you are going to build." And they list here 100,000 talents of gold, 1,000,000 talents of silver, quantities of bronze, iron, too great to be weighed, wood and stone. All of the things that you would need to build a temple. And frankly, I think those numbers are exaggerated to demonstrate their importance. 1,000,000 talents of silver is an unimaginable quantity. They are simply saying he put aside everything necessary, huge quantities of gold and silver, because that was the literary practice of the people in that part of the world at that time. He also laid in stone cutters, masons, carpenters, all kinds of craftsmen, goldsmiths, silversmiths, bronze and iron workers. In other words, he got everything ready to go. He's hired people, he's laid out the materials, and it says he gave his son Solomon plans for the temple, what it was supposed to look like. He gave him the plans of all that the Spirit had put in his mind. In other words, he was inspired by the Spirit. Here's the temple I want, here's what it's going to look like, and that's why he laid in all these materials. So they got the plans, the contractors, the builders, and the materials, everything. And then he said, "Begin the work, and Yahweh be with you." And then David died, and we're told that Solomon gave orders to build a temple for the name of Yahweh and a royal palace for himself. Now, he spent 7 years building the temple, and he spent 13 years building the palace. And Ron came up after class last time and gave an answer that I think is really good. He was saying that the temple could be built in 7 years because everything's there. But the palace, you had to draw up the plans, you had to work things out, you had to get the permits. That takes a little bit of time. And I think he's right. It took a lot longer to build. Basically, he was building a sub-city up there around the temple. So perhaps it isn't quite as egregious an action as it seemed. But it says the temple was 60 cubits long, 20 cubits wide, and 30 cubits high. What is that in feet? That's 90 feet long, 30 feet wide, and 45 feet high. That's not a big building. When you think about palaces and temples and so on, it's only 30 feet wide, probably not much wider than this room. I'm guessing this room may be 25 feet, 30 feet. And they also tell you what it looks like. A portico at the front, clerestory windows at the top to let light in, side rooms, an inner sanctuary, which was God's room. That's where God would live. And we don't know exactly what it looked like. I could tell you I'm building a house that's 50 feet by 40 feet. It has a door and 2 windows on the first floor and 3 windows on the second floor and sliding doors in the back. And you can picture generally what it looks like, but you don't know precisely because we aren't given the decorative details. But anyway, it says everything was cedar. No stone was to be seen. It's a stone building, and he paneled it inside with cedar. And then he gold-plated it. Solomon overlaid the whole interior with gold, the floors of both the inner and outer rooms of the temple with gold. This is gold foil, hammered gold, real thin, flexible, that they could put up in plates like pictures. You just one section after another. So it's not quite as much gold, but that's a lot of gold in a building this size. So we know it was rectangular. It was like a shoebox turned on its side. And we're told it was 60 by 30 by 20 cubits. And the question is, why just 20 cubits? A very fine archaeologist, Lane Rittmeyer, explained it to me. I asked him, I said, that's pretty small for a palace, or even a palace, let alone a temple. And he said the size of a building, the size of a room, is determined by the width of the span that you can put across the top to support the ceiling. What's the biggest supporting material was a cedar of Lebanon, about 30 feet long. And so to make the roof would be very unimpressive. It would be all these beams, and then they'd cross-hatch it and thatch it. So if you could see it from above, it was unimpressive, but that's how they built those buildings in those days. So that's why it's only 20 cubits wide. If you want to make it 90 cubits wide, you put more pillars in and more beams, and then you have pillars or walls inside. But to make it one big open room, this is as big as it could be. So it was an impressive building. And we're told it had a door. We know the doors are on the short end because we have foundations of temples similar to this around the world. It had pillars of some sort out in front and a portico. We don't know whether it was covered or whatnot, but it was something similar to this. And then it said there was a room inside that was 20 by 20 by 20 cubits. That's a cube. That's God's room. That's the Holy of Holies. The space in front of it is the most holy, as the holy, and then the most holy is that's the actual bedroom for the Lord to live in. They thought he was there physically in that room. But it raises an interesting little architectural question. It's as wide as the temple, but it's not as tall as the temple. The cube, of course, was regarded as a sacred geometric shape. We don't know why. All of the ancient cultures had high regard for the cube, so we understand that. But why was the temple made taller than the Holy of Holies? Because there were 40 cubits out in front. So it was divided in thirds, which is the way we see temples in those days. Well, here's the answer. It's built on a hill. And you put the altar or the room for God at the highest place. The high place. That's what the high place originally was. It was the highest place up there on the hill. Later on, any little shrine was called a high place. But you would put this cube in which God lived up at the highest place, and then when you build the temple around it, as the hill is sloping away, you see, you have higher walls to make it look right. And that means you'd have to have some kind of a ramp or a stairway or whatever, and then the floor. And this is a reproduction of the temple by Lane Rittmeyer. And you had the altar out in front, big altar. And we are given the dimensions of that. There were some side rooms for storage, but those would be outside. They would not compromise the integrity, the architectural integrity inside. And then the Holy of Holies was almost like a stage. And it was gold-plated in there, and you can imagine that this is the most impressive place that you could walk into in those days. A gold-plated temple, Holy of Holies for the Lord, which was a raised platform because it was on the highest part of the hill. This particular site has actually been archaeologically identified by Lane Rittmeyer, and I think he's right. Unfortunately, it's in the Dome of the Rock, the gold shrine that's dedicated to Muhammad. But the big stone in there is where is the highest place of Mount Moriah, and that's where the temple was built originally. So this is probably a very good representation. He spent 7 years building it, and as Ron pointed out, it took 13 years to complete the palace because he had to get the permits and the plans and the materials and everything else. Okay, what did they do with it once it was built? They brought the ark up from Zion, the city of David. Now remember, you're up here on Mount Moriah. The city of David's down there because it all slopes down to the city of David. So they brought it out of the city of David, brought it up, put it in the temple, and then built a wall around the temple and the administrative buildings that included the city of David and made the extended city that we later see. So he brought the ark up. The priests put it in its place in the inner sanctuary of the temple, the most holy place, that cuboidal room, the Holy of Holies. And when the priests withdrew, the cloud filled the temple of Yahweh. That's the Lord coming in. The priests could not perform their service because of the cloud, for the glory of the Lord filled his temple. So he finally came into his house, the house of the Lord. And the king and all the Israelites dedicated the temple of the Lord, and there's a whole section in there where Solomon is praying and making offerings and so forth. And then, of course, his betrayal comes later. He began to build high places, little shrines to the various pagan gods on the very platform which the temple was located. Here it is. You can see the city of Jerusalem. Once Solomon was finished, he had the temple up on the hill there, and then an entire extension to the city. Those would be administrative buildings and palaces and so forth, and the wall was extended. As the centuries passed, eventually the population spilled out onto what's called the Western Hill that you can see there, and that's the city of Jerusalem about the time of Christ. That's the Roman time. That big building up on the top of the hill there is Herod's palace. And Herod in 18 BC said the temple's not impressive enough, probably trying to impress his Jewish subjects who didn't fully accept him. And what he did was he began an expansion of the temple that took 40 years. And when it was finished, we have that huge rectangular platform that's there today. We can see those walls. So that would have been the city at the time of Christ. They had completed the temple just a couple of years before Christ was crucified. Here's a view of it from Herod's palace is right below you at the bottom of the picture, looking down towards the platform that was the Herodian expansion. And we are given this passage in Mark. As he was leaving the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what massive stones, what magnificent buildings." The temple's been completed. The Temple Mount has been completed. They're looking around at this spectacular building that was improved and built by Herod. And what was the response of Jesus? He said, "Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone here will be left on another. Every one will be thrown down." That happened 30 years later. The Romans came in 70 AD after a Jewish revolt, and they leveled the city of Jerusalem, tore it down to the ground, tore down the temple. The Temple Mount was still there, partially ruined, but the city itself was completely destroyed, and so there's really nothing. When you go on your tours through Jerusalem and they say, here's where this happened, here's where that happened, it didn't. Because that was all gone. The city was rebuilt by the Romans, destroyed again, rebuilt again, and a lot of what you see there is Crusader, much later, or Roman things in the 3rd, 4th, 5th centuries. But if we take a look, that's what happened. The city was destroyed, everything. Except for those towers right at that point, at what's called the Jaffa Gate. The city was destroyed by the Romans, but they determined to leave those towers there as an indication of the magnificence of the city that they destroyed. You foment rebellion, this is what happens to your city, and they left those as an indication of what the city's magnificence was prior to its destruction. And those foundations are still there today. Now, one other thing, not one stone here will be left on another. Every one will be thrown down. At the base of this big platform, when they were excavating in the 1980s, 1990s, they found all these stones piled up, and they left some of them there for tourists to look at to show you the nature of the destruction that the Romans had done. And you get a sense, look at those stones.
Is that Roger?
No, that's not. That's me when I was younger. Come on. I still had brown hair. Yes. Goodness. It looks like Roger almost. Oh, my. Well, what you had up there, imagine 70, 80, or 100 feet up the side of this wall, these magnificent stones that make the periphery of it, and the Romans took their crowbars and knocked the stones off until the pile got so high they couldn't go down any lower. And some of those stones have been used to rebuild the walls as you see them now, but that gives you a sense of the magnificence of the city, the size of the stones, and the tragedy of the destruction, the nature of the destruction. So one last thing, that area right there, that section of that wall, when it was excavated, has become that famous Western Wall. That's the retaining wall, and you can see it right there. That's the Western Wall. It's no longer called the Wailing Wall, incidentally. It's called the Western Wall.
They still put little prayers?
They still do their praying. That's as close as Jewish worshipers can get to where the temple used to be. They can't get up on top because that's all Palestinian Authority. That's where the mosque is, and that's where the Dome of the Rock is. So they can't go up on top. They worship at the wall. We do have a few moments. I wanted to leave some time for a couple of questions. All of the events that happen later on in the Book of Kings will be Good, the Bad, and the Ugly Part 2 if we ever get around to it. But were there some questions?
Why is it not called the Wailing Wall?
That's considered demeaning. It's a sign of the Wailing Wall. They're weak and they're sad and they're wailing, as opposed to the Western Wall, because Israel is a powerful nation now and they wanted to change the perception. So they stopped calling it the Wailing Wall maybe about 10, 15 years ago. Was it ever called the Wailing Wall when you were there? No. Question? Back there? Yeah.
When Solomon abandoned his faith, did he do it by little small increments, or was it one big increment that changed his faith?
The question was, did Solomon just suddenly become a pagan, or did he kind of grow into it? I would argue that he grew into it. He had all of these pagan wives, and they were told long ago during the time of the Exodus that you are not to intermarry with the Canaanites when you come into the land, because they will turn your heart away from me. That's what the Lord was saying. My guess is he had all these women, and they were saying, can we put up an altar here? And he gave permission, and then can I put up an altar there? And he slowly was seduced into his betrayal. But eventually he reached the ultimate betrayal by worshiping Chemosh and Malach, who may be the same god. One was Ammonite and one was Moabite, and they're kind of the same name, but that's the worst of the pagan gods. Absolutely the worst. Any other questions? Roger.
Bring It Today, and there's a lot of discussion about the movement of our embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, which is received very, very negatively from the standpoint of the Arab states. Can you talk a little bit about why that is?
Roger's question was, what about moving the embassy to Jerusalem today? That's political. Just as a quick mention, Jerusalem has long been regarded by the Muslim populations in that area as their territory. Now there were Jewish quarters around Jerusalem, and they have lived there all along. But it has been their opinion that those Jewish territories are the extent and the limit of what they're allowed to have, and we have Jewish communities being developed all around Jerusalem and extending the suburbs out, and it's regarded as an invasion, basically, of their territory by bringing an embassy up there. The embassy was put down in Tel Aviv because that was part of the original partition for the country of Israel back in 1948 by the UN. And Jerusalem was kind of regarded as an international city, and they feel that bringing an embassy up there might be about, I don't know. It's all part of a very complicated story, and we just don't have time for it. But it will be regarded as an invasion of sorts, a political invasion, if the embassy is ever moved to Jerusalem.
So Solomon leaving his faith like that, is he not saved?
The question is, what is Solomon not saved because he abandoned his faith? There are many. This is one of the questions I have, and you get different answers, but you get certain people who seem to have been required to perform certain acts, like Judas. And there's a huge body of debate about whether Judas had to do that or whether it was foreseen, but it's all part of the plan. And the same way with Solomon, I don't know. I don't know what the answer would be, but there are lots of arguments about why he did it and what the result would be personally for him. And I don't have an answer for that. Yes?
Was the Western Wall broken down by the Romans and rebuilt, or is it the wall that's been there all along?
If you look at the Western Wall, there's still another 50 feet of rubble that's accumulated down to the road along the front of the wall. They've only taken away part of it, and about 10 or 15 feet of that is original Herodian stone. Everything else is broken stones. When the Romans knocked the wall over, you begin to have rubble piling up, and you reach a point where you just can't go down any further, or you'd have to start carrying things away. So there is some of the original wall down under that, and when they rebuilt, when Nehemiah rebuilt the wall, and subsequently Suleiman the Magnificent rebuilt the wall, they used the rubble that was lying there, and they just built it up, and you have all these broken, mismatched rocks that go all the way up to create it. But the Romans took down as much as they could, and then they just had to quit. Because you get a big pile of those rocks that are the size of footlockers, you don't want to have to carry them away. So you just leave it. The wall's been destroyed. Same way with the city walls. When Nehemiah built the walls, all the materials were there. And he just assigned a section to each tribal group, and they went out and they used the rocks that were there, and they were able to put it up in 30 days, 40 days? Can't remember. Anyway, you can't build a wall that fast unless the materials are already there.
Where the Jews and the tourists go, that's part of the original?
You mean the Western Wall?
Yeah.
The bottom side of it is, the lowest level, yeah, that's still Herodian. That's still original. Everything else is rebuilt over and over again. And so we got to quit in just a moment.
The interesting thing was about the stones. When Herod had these great, huge stones, he wanted everybody to know that he was the one that built it. And he dressed the stones, which means on the outside edge there's kind of a bevel on them. The big Herodian stones have this thing that's called dressed stones, and they're different from the others.
Yeah, the point was that's how we know those are original Herodian stones, because he decorated them a specific way, and we can still see some of those. They would have been covered up by all of the others falling down, and so that's why they were not specifically destroyed.
So when you're saying at the base of the Western Wall, there's still more below you?
Oh, yeah, another 25, 30 feet down. There's a tunnel along there that they've actually tunneled at the very base of it, and they talk about, it's not a tunnel back under the mount. It's a tunnel where the original street would have been that Jesus and the disciples walked up. But you can't dig all the way down to there. There's just too much. That's 2,000 years of rubble that has been building up. The city went up to the very top back in the 1900s. I mean, they literally just built the city all the way up to the level of the current plateau, the current Temple Mount. and they've dug down. But so with that, we're finished. Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. That's Class 8.
Bible Interact, uncovering the mysteries of the kingdom of God. At BibleInteract.tv, you will penetrate the scriptures of the Bible. At our store, you're just one click away from owning your favorite books, DVDs, or study guides. Earn a degree from our university and watch hundreds of video presentations from biblical scholars, archaeologists, and theologians. By subscribing to Bible Interact, you'll find all the resources you'll need, so why not subscribe today? Go to www.BibleInteract.tv. You'll be glad you did. Interested in studying more about the temple, the Messiah, or what God's plan is for our future? No problem. We've got you covered. With more than 200 DVDs, books, and workbooks, you'll find the answers you've been searching for. Bible Interact, uncovering the mysteries of the kingdom of God.